Welcome to this third video where we'll explain what happened in the second study on interactive tutoring. In the previous video on naturalistic tutoring, we saw that when tutors were told to tutor in the way they felt most comfortable and natural, they tended to use a didactic style of tutoring where they talked much more than the student and rarely prompted the student for his or her own responses. Part of the results of this study was that even though the tutors gave many explanations on the content, this did not help the students to gain deep transferable knowledge. Deep learning only happened when students had self-initiated monitoring statements where they detected their own mistakes and corrected them. We will now look at the second study on interactive tutoring and see what happens when the same tutors who are now working with different students were told to suppress giving unsolicited feedback and explanations and instead prompted students for more explanations in an effort to increase dialogue and constructive responses. To do this, the tutors asked open-ended, content-free questions such as, "Any thoughts on that sentence? What does this sentence mean? Could you explain what you are thinking? Can you explain this in your own words? Could you clarify what you just said?" A typical dialogue in this study looks like this. The student reads some text, then some question and answer discussion follows. We can already see that the tutor asked more questions than in the first study and even holds back from giving an explanation when the student doesn't know the answer. We also see the student making an effort to understand the content. We can also look at some graphs to see how the second study compared to the first. This graph shows us the number of times that the tutor and student spoke first. On the left, we can see that the tutor spoke first far more than the students in the first study. On the right, we see that in the second study, the students not only spoke first far more than the students did in the first study, but even spoke first more than the tutors did. This tells us that as the tutors stepped back and took less control over the dialogue, this allowed the students to be more involved and to control the discussion more. This next graph is similar to the previous one, but shows us the average number of statements by the tutors and students. Once again, we see in the first study how much more the tutors talked than the students. Then in the second study, we can see that the tutors clearly followed the directions of the researchers, and not only did the tutors talk much less, but the students, once again, spoke more than the tutors. In addition, we can also see how much the tutors' explanations and feedback changed from the first study to the second. The number of explanations they gave went from 327 in the first tutoring study down to 7 in the second study when they prompted more. The amount of feedback they gave also went from 94 to 44. However, the difference in tutoring style does not mean much unless the students learned at least as much as the students did in the first study. Since this second study focused on prompting students, the question is, how did this affect student learning? Did the students still learn as much, and then were they able to achieve deeper learning? The answer is yes. Even though the tutors gave far fewer explanations and the students seemed to even struggle at times to understand the content, the students in the interactive prompting study learned just as much and even more. We can see here that in terms of the first three question categories, that student learning was nearly equal in both studies. This is significant, but it also tells us that the students are not necessarily worse off when the tutor does most of the talking. However, when we look at the fourth category of questions that measure deep transferable learning, we see a much bigger difference, with the prompted students being able to transfer their learning better than the tutored students in the first study. But what was it about the second study with its emphasis on prompting students that allowed the students to gain deeper knowledge? There are 3 reasons that the authors cite for the increase in learning from the prompted students. The first is that students were more constructive when prompted as opposed to being directly tutored. The second is that the interactive dialogue, with the emphasis on the tutor asking more questions, allowed students to be able to master an idea. And third, the students took greater responsibility for their learning. These 3 things are the result of the tutor holding back from explaining concepts and even answering all of the students' questions, and instead prompting and allowing the student to put forth the effort to work through the ideas. This teaching approach, with the emphasis on prompting, created an active learning environment and allowed students to be constructive, gain deeper, more transferable knowledge, and to take more responsibility over their learning.